Hey, Tara, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Thank you for handling the questions. Appreciate it.
No problem.
We'll just give it another minute or two for anybody else joining, and then we'll begin, and I'll let everybody in as they come. Go, you can see my whole head. Go ahead and start with some introductions here. So I just wanted to welcome everybody to today's webinar, and thank you for connecting for the Women in Financial Empowerment series. We're going to start with some housekeeping information, tell you a little bit about WomenIN, and then introduce our guest speaker. So we will monitor the chat window for any comments or questions for today's presenters, so please feel free to use this feature. All participants are muted. That's just to reduce background noise and distractions. And I wanted to quickly welcome MegaPixx Media, who is broadcasting this webinar live as well as recording it. So a little bit about WomenIN. So we are an inclusive community supporting today's women and working together to build the women of tomorrow. We connect women aged 20 plus to our hub of events, networks, resources, and leadership. And I wanted today to introduce Zhang. So Zhang is the co-founder of ETCH Sourcing, a Canadian consultancy specializing in providing strategy and execution services in the sourcing, procurement, and category management space. She loves people, solving problems, and has years of expertise building and executing multi-million-dollar tactical strategies and strategic contractual negotiations. She graduated from the Haskayne School of Business, and she now builds courses and teaches business contract negotiations with her co-founder to give back to her alma mater. So with no further ado, welcome Zhang.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tara, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session today on the art of negotiations. So first of all, thanks so much for taking time out of your lunch hours to join me. I do believe that negotiations is an art form and can be a lot of fun when practiced. So to start out our session today, I did want to give you a little bit of context about myself. Thank you again, Tara, for that great introduction. I am the co-founder and co-CEO of ETCH Sourcing, and our team really believes in working as an extension of our clients. So our team is always on the ground, and we negotiate every single day on behalf of our clients. So we always joke that we basically get paid to talk for a living. But that is something that we are very, very passionate about. For myself specifically, I do come from industry where I've built over 10 years of experience in negotiating contracts on behalf of large organizations. Additionally, as Tara had mentioned, we have built and delivered for 3 years now a course around business contract negotiations. So I guess you can say that this is a topic that I feel a lot of passion for. So the reality of negotiations is that we all negotiate every single day, from big things like salary, major purchases, to small things like getting your kids to give up the TV to go outside, or even negotiating it with yourself, for that extra 5 minutes in bed in the morning before you have to get up and start your day. And a lot of us actually just go about our day-to-day with that. So we wanted to really start off today's session with a quick question and something for you to think about. What brings you here today? And so feel free to put your question in the Q&A box. I will be able to see them. And really, I want people to start thinking about, what is it that you really want to focus on in your negotiations and in learning out of the negotiations today. So to learn about negotiations, I like to start at the root. So with the actual word to negotiate. So it's really defined, it's a verb, it's defined by the Oxford Dictionary as, the ability to obtain or bring about by discussion, to find a way over or through an obstacle or difficult route, or to transfer. But my favorite definition of this word is actually the origination of this word. So the origination of negotiate actually comes from the Latin word doing the course of business, or negotiate, which then further breaks down into basically the root, which is neg, meaning not, and otium, which means leisure. So if you put it together, it basically means not for fun. And in my opinion, negotiations is actually something very enjoyable. It's something that once you have a structured approach to it, once you know how to approach it, it can be a lot of fun if you're prepared for it. So when it comes to negotiations, we typically like to liken it to a three-legged stool. Really, it's founded on facts, relationships, and leverage. Facts are really the data and the logic that supports your reasoning. So things like how much does your comparable sell for? How much does the market rate sit at today? Leverage is the incentive that the party you're negotiating with has to actually listen to you and to actually be able to take on your opinion and your stance and to bring that into their world. And then really relationships are your existing relationship with the individual or organization. Without any of these, it's not so much that the negotiation itself will be impossible, but it will be extremely difficult. And we have basically 5 fundamental principles that ensure where possible you do have a smooth negotiation. So the first thing is really be prepared. Know your research, know your facts and data. If you're selling a car, what are the comparables? What's the market like? If you're negotiating your salary, who else is out there? What is the job market currently like? What does the salary bench look like? And second point, and this is actually my favorite and most important, of the 5 points here, is be hard on the facts, but also easy on the people. A lot of the times when we're negotiating, people get caught up in emotions, and they start to involve themselves personally in the negotiation. So one of the big things that we have to remember is the negotiation is a mutual dialogue to really drive towards an end result. So make sure you never start to involve your personal attacks or any sort of your personal emotions there, but be tough on the facts that you've already studied here. And we've encountered in our experience and in all my years of negotiating a wide variety of personalities, of personas. And it can be very hard to remind yourself that you do have to be hard on the facts, but easy on the people, because ultimately at the end of the day, everyone is just there and they are still people. The third point is really, it is built on strong relationships. So if this is a new relationship for you, if it's a new individual, take the time to get to know them as a person, because you are dealing in a conversation with that individual. So make sure that you are taking the time to get to know them as a human being. What are their interests, rather than jumping straight into your negotiation. If it's an older relationship, it's all the more important to understand where you are at with them in your relationship status. Has something just happened recently that could actually put that relationship at risk, or has shaken that relationship, or has something that happened, or is there a potential emotional debt there that's old? Essentially, where are you right now in that relationship with that other individual? And the first point is really to align internally first. So in corporate negotiations, we remind everyone that there is more than one party in negotiation. And this holds true in personal negotiations as well. So knowing and understanding who the people are who could internally impact your negotiations and making sure that they're aligned. So if any of you have ever been in a situation where you're negotiating, whether you're with a partner or with somebody else, and you present something and they come back and you're pushing for an end goal, and you think that there's an additional bit to push, but then your partner might be the person who speaks up and says, okay, you know what? I think this is good. Or actually, I don't want to buy this and I want to go somewhere else. So making sure that you're aligned first and foremost internally with the other parties that are going to be involved in your negotiation is absolutely critical. And at this point, this plays out a lot more in the corporate setting. We see this play out far more in the corporate setting, but it can actually also happen a lot more in your personal negotiations as well. Shutting down backdoor selling. So, there oftentimes, we have in our business working on behalf of large organizations, we're not the ultimate decision maker. We are ultimately the people who are working on behalf of our clients, we're negotiating on behalf of our clients. And the decision maker is an internal stakeholder, it's an internal business party. So when you are in a situation with that type of relationship setup, it's absolutely critical that you have that backdoor selling shut down. What that means is, you know that your suppliers, your other party, your negotiating party is not going around you to go and get the approval of somebody else before you even get to the negotiation table, because then you're in a very sticky situation. And as far as personal negotiations, this is probably most prevalent and most prevalently presented in the context of your kids coming up to you saying, well, but dad said I could stay on the computer for an extra 20 minutes. I've already gone and I've already gotten the approval that I need to even be in this negotiation. So, when you're trying to negotiate for your kids to come off the computer, but he's like, well, but I already got the approval from dad. So, just FYI, this negotiation, it's not happening. I'm staying on the computer for another 30 minutes. And that's probably the most, one of the most common ways that it presents itself. Now, there are 3 key principles to structured negotiations that we do recommend you to familiarize yourself with. And these key principles will kind of help guide you and help you to feel more comfortable and with your negotiations. So the first is really to know your negotiation toolkit. And I'm going to touch on some elements of negotiation strategies, negotiation tools that we've used a lot in our negotiations today. But it's also to make sure that you yourself know what are the styles, what are the tools that you're most familiar with, that you yourself really want to feel comfortable working with. The second thing is really to know the negotiation process. A lot of people think that a negotiation starts when the discourse actually happens. So, when we're actually in dialogue and we're going back and forth. But there's actually many, many steps that actually precede a negotiation. And there's actually many steps that actually follow a negotiation. So being comfortable with your negotiation process, being comfortable with what it means to actually be part of a negotiation will help you recognize and help you prepare yourself in advance for a negotiation. And then knowing your leverage. So I cannot emphasize that enough when it comes to leverage, because knowing when to use leverage is what is going to make and break your negotiations. It's going to be what helps you to persuade the other individual to look at things from your angle, to buy in from your perspective and to your perspective, and to really carry that message back to their organization if they're negotiating on behalf of the organization, or in some cases, just make a decision. And knowing your leverage, how to use it, because these are the elements that actually will sway the other party to your side. So I'm going to get into negotiation techniques. And what we provided here are some of the basic techniques that we have seen here in terms of our negotiations and some of the techniques that we use quite often, and some of the techniques that we teach the students in our courses. Now, in addition to these techniques, there are many, many other negotiation techniques out there. One thing I really do want to emphasize is every negotiator has their own style. You have your own style, you have your own personality, you have your own flow. And each of us is probably going to feel more inclined to some techniques than other techniques. So that's why it's so important to know your negotiation toolkit, so that you know not only what's in it, but also what works and what you're comfortable with using. So the first one is broken record. So that's essentially repeating that message again and again. And we'll talk a little bit about building an opening statement. But broken record is essentially re-emphasizing your leverage. And what you typically end up repeating a lot more is your leverage, your position, and your reasoning and logic behind these messages. So in a business negotiation, it can sound something like, well, I definitely appreciate that, but this year we have been going through some financial stress and budgets are cut, so we are going to need to see that reduction happen. So things like that, where it is repeating that message, and it actually links very well with the next technique, which is around deflecting. So deflecting is essentially avoiding direct verbal hooks or questions by deflecting your answer, and broken record is a great deflection tactic. So if you're finding yourself in a negotiation and somebody is coming to you with a direct verbal hook, direct question saying, okay, but I I really need to like, so can you guys accept the position of, 500,000 or not? And being able to deflect that question and say, well, look, right now we're in a time of critical financial stress and budgets have been cut. So we really need you to decrease that financial burden upon us. So you can use the broken record to deflect and avoid that direct verbal hook or question. Silence is one that a lot of extroverts have a really hard time with. And it's one that we do this activity in class quite often when we teach this course at the University of Calgary. We have students actually sit in silence for about 60 seconds. And in about 10 seconds, you can tell who the extroverts are in the room because they immediately start becoming very uncomfortable and they start shifting in their seats. They start trying to fill that dialogue. And it's a very effective sales tactic if you're against, you're with somebody who is a very extroverted salesperson. Car salesmen are a great example of this. A lot of car salesmen are very naturally extroverted. They're inclined to be charming. They're inclined to be, talkative. And when you fall silent in a conversation, it creates a gap in the flow of conversation. And most people will be naturally inclined to fill it. And some of them will actually start negotiating against themselves. We had this happen with a car purchase that my co-founder had actually gone to do one summer. And he fell silent during the negotiation and the salesperson started negotiating with themselves. So they started saying, okay, 20,000, does that work? Silence. Not yes, not no. Okay, well, let me see what else I can do. So he goes away, comes back, and says, okay, I got it. I got approval to lower it by another 1,000. So 19,000. How's that? And still silence. Okay, if you don't like that, let me see what else I can do, and so on and so forth. And a lot of times they start talking about, why this is such a great deal, why all of this stuff, everything they're trying to persuade against you. But also, it does make the extroverts very, very uncomfortable. Now, with self-disclosure, this is definitely one of the techniques I think that requires a lot more EQ. It's an acknowledgement that you understand the other party's position, but it doesn't really address any right or wrong. So what we talk about in this position is having the ability to actually relate and to acknowledge that, you actually have been listening. You have been listening to the other party's issues. You have been listening to the other party's leverage and where their positioning is from. However, you can then link it back to broken record and combine it together and say, I definitely appreciate that you have your target that you're trying to hit right now or that you're coming up on your end. However, we definitely have financial pressures, ordinary financial pressures this year, and we definitely have a budget constraint that we need to work towards. So linking that back to your broken record. And then one of the final techniques that I'll talk about is more around rational inquiry. And it's about asking fact-based questions to get to the root of the problem. And we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean to discover the root of a problem in our later slides here. But it's around focusing our questions and our questioning line of thought to individuals to say, why are they pushing so hard? Why is it that they have a financial crunch for the end of the year? Why is it that the individual is coming back to say that they absolutely cannot make the number or the request work? I absolutely can't go outside to play. Well, why is that? Like, what is it that's fundamentally the root of the problem here? Is it that, your child just really wants to stay on the computer, or is there something a little bit more where it's like maybe they actually had a whole gym class today and they're extremely sunburned and so they don't feel like going outside and being exposed to the sun. So it's around asking those fact-based questions to get to the root of the problem. And all of these techniques are effective individually, but they're the most effective when you actually link them all together. So you can use broken records to deflect. You can use silence to create a gap in the flow, find out more information, after which you can use follow-up with fact-based questions to dig down into the root of the problem once you have the additional information, and then you can acknowledge the other party's position with self-disclosure. And as with anything else, techniques work best when you practice them again and again and again. And the more that you practice them, the more familiar you will become with them, the more comfortable you will become with them. So in terms of the negotiation process, most of the time when people think that they have a negotiation, it's those two steps at the bottom where, there's discussion and there's an offer and counter offer. That's where most people define as a negotiation process. Oh, we've started talking, we started discussing, therefore we are now in a negotiation. We've made an offer, we've made a counter offer. However, there's actually a lot of steps to the negotiation process in advance. So we start with preparation. And preparation is so critical, where absolutely people need to be prepared. You need to be prepared for your negotiation. And you can't go into a negotiation with the idea that you're going to wing it. Even the most skilled negotiators I've seen never go into a negotiation with the idea that they're going to wing it. We do dry runs, we do mock negotiations, and that is what you need to do in order to make sure that you are actually prepared. Do you have your facts? Do you have your story? How are you going to position your story? And that's really the important part of understanding your opening position. So your opening position is how you initially begin your negotiation. What are you asking for? What is your leverage? And how are you going to structure all of that information in a way that appeals to the human being that you're actually negotiating with? Because if you come up to a person and you say, okay, I want 10% off, that's not a negotiation, it's more of a demand, right? But if you come to them with the logic, the reasoning, the facts and the data that you've prepared and you've gathered during your preparation, and you come to them with the leverage itself, then you can structure that into an opening position. Hey, you've been on the computer a lot for the last 5 hours, and I know you came back from school and you're very tired. However, we both know that, being on the computer for a long time is something that can be very detrimental to your health. So why don't you take a break now and go outside for 30 minutes versus get outside for 30 minutes? It's a different framing of your opening position. And knowing how you're going to frame that opening position is super critical to beginning that negotiation and beginning the discussion part, which is really the back and forth discussion. That's where you can actually employ a lot of the techniques that we just reviewed in that past slide with, broken record, with deflection, with all of the dialogue that needs to happen. And then really your offer and counter offer. So, you started with an open position, somebody else came to you and they might make you a counter offer, and then you might make a counter offer back, and so on and so forth until you guys reach consensus. Now, it is very important before you go into that stage, before you commence the dialogue, before you commence the discussion, before you even go into your opening position, in the preparation stage, you have to know what your aim high is and what your bottom line is. So when we talk about aim highs, it is basically your target, your initial target, your initial opening position. It has to be high enough that you still have room to move, but it also has to be reasonable. It has to be defensible. It has to be something that's based on facts and data, and not something that you've actually just, said, okay, well, I'm going to ask for 10,000 because I actually really want 2,000, and it's going to make it so that I have lots of room to wiggle. Well, if what you're asking for, if that 10,000 isn't founded on facts and data, there's a chance that, you'll ask for 10,000 and the other party is going to look at you and be like, that's absolutely ridiculous. That's not something we can entertain, and have a nice day. And that's it. And there's no further negotiation to be had because you've already positioned yourself in a position where now you're going to have to go back and backtrack. And that immediately causes you to lose leverage. And that immediately causes you to actually, have to lose your reputation as well, to lose a lot of reputability in your negotiation. So just a quick question that we have received. There's a term called anchoring in your negotiations. So that is making sure that you are continuously anchoring back into your specific position. So for example, if I'm a seller and I'm negotiating against a buyer, I might have a sales position of 100,000. The buyer is asking for 80,000. And if I make a move to say, I drop my price by $5,000, that's a 5% concession on my part. Anchoring means for the buyer side, they're going back to say, okay, well, no, because you haven't, I'm asking for 80,000 and you're still at 95,000. So you're still 15,000 higher. Whereas if I look at it from a seller side perspective, well, I've already decreased my price by $5,000. So it's always anchoring back into your original position. And so when we look at your bottom line, that's why it's always so important to know what your aim high is and also know what your bottom line is, because your bottom line is going to be that number or that element that you're going to walk away at. And in your preparation stage, you have to prepare all of this. You have to prepare so that you know what your aim high is going to be in that negotiation, what your bottom line is going to be, and then what your best alternative is going to be. Because if you can't negotiate this, if you cannot close this negotiation, if your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or a BATNA as we call it, is non-existent, then you have no choice but to close. It puts you in a position where you have a total lack of leverage, and you are putting yourself at a disadvantage in that negotiation. If you know what your bottom line is, and you know what your alternative is going to be when you move on into, if you can't close and if you reach your bottom line, you're going to feel comfortable and secure in understanding that I can walk away from this negotiation. I also know what I can't counteroffer to. So I know what I'm limited to. I know where I want to close. If I can't close within that grid, I can't close within that range, well, then I can take a step back, and then I know I have another alternative to go to. And then closure. Closure can present itself in a lot of ways. So, you guys have an offer, counter offer, you shake hands, everything's good, and then people walk away. Now, how are you actually going to close the negotiation? In the professional setting, it's making sure that you document everything. Making sure that you had a great dialogue, fantastic, we agree on these points. Now, go back, summarize it, and send an email out. Make sure that it's clear and articulated, because there's a lot of communication gaps that can sometimes happen during negotiations, where people can sometimes come back and say, well, I had thought that we had negotiated and agreed upon ABC, when really you had interpreted their negotiation and their agreement on just A and B. So we run exercises where we will run mock negotiations, when we run negotiation training for big corporations, and we've done this before as well, where we ask parties to negotiate together, and they'll go through a very heated hour exercise or hour and a half exercise of negotiating. They'll leverage, they'll use all of their strategies, all of their tools, and then they end up in the situation where they said, okay, listen, we have consensus, it's fantastic, we agree, great, write out your proposals. Write out what you've actually negotiated. Write out what you've actually agreed to close at. And you get the papers in, and sometimes the numbers don't match. Or sometimes the numbers match, but the terms associated with the numbers don't match. And it's, oh, we've agreed to give a credit of $5,000 at the end of the term. Or somebody else has interpreted that as, we've agreed to give a credit of $5,000 spread throughout the term. And that has a very different connotation on the overarching structure of how that deal is set up. So when it comes to negotiations, and when it comes to closure in your personal negotiations, in your personal life, whether it's directly with your friends, family, children, closure is really important, because it's that recap step. It's that, okay, so we agree now, this is what you're going to do, these are the next action items, and this is how we've aligned in terms of this negotiation. Now, on to leverage. Leverage is something that, as I said, is really the heart and soul of negotiations. What it is, it's really facts that give you a position of strength. So in business context, it's a long-term business contract, it's a stable financial situation. In a personal negotiation, it can be anything from the fact that, well, we had pizza five nights of the week already, and this is a 6th night. So, this is a fact that we know, and I've consented previously on the last 5 nights. Now you have a position. How do you actually find leverage? Well, it's about understanding your position and the counterparty's position, as well as any additional market influences. So every negotiation is unique, and leverage can be varied based on the timing and the market changes. That's why it's so important to do that preparation step fully, to actually look at the other influences, look at what's worked, what hasn't worked. One of the great things that you can do with for example, your personal negotiations in the context of selling a house is study the market, study what's out there, study what's comparable, and then understand your position in the market. Is it a seller's market? Is it a buyer's market? Are houses flying off of the marketplace and people are bidding higher and closing higher at market rate? Or has this house been listed for 5 months and it hasn't moved at all, and they've dropped their prices already by 20% of what they listed at? These are important facts that will give you a position of strength. So when do you actually use leverage? In that opening discussion. It's a part of bringing that opening position to life and really making sure that you emphasize why you're there and why you're asking for what you're asking for. And then when the other party becomes reluctant to negotiate, so if your leverage is, I know you need to close this by the end of the month, and they become reluctant to negotiate with you, you can remind them of that. Listen, you know what? I know you need to close this deal by the end of the month, so let's come back to the table. Let's continue to negotiate. And then before your counter offer. So before you have a counter offer, before you give somebody a counter offer, always make sure you recap your leverage. Yes, this has been $10,000. You're ready to make a concession. Maybe it's $2,000 concession. Listen, I'm still going to tell you that right now the market's really hard. We're in a difficult financial position. There's a lot of budgets, all of this stuff. Therefore, that being said, I've heard where you're coming from, so self-disclosure, and I'm willing to make a concession of additional $2,000 off my price. What can really endanger leverage is backdoor selling. When it comes to business requirements, and also when it comes to your personal negotiations. We talked about it. If somebody's already gone behind your back and understood and gotten consensus from somebody, and they know already you have a budget of 500,000 and you're trying to negotiate for 450, they're going to say, well, I know your budget and I know it's 500,000. I know you're authorized to close the 500,000, so go ahead and close. If you're at a car dealership and your partner has been pulled to the side by the salesperson and he has revealed that, we're just looking, we have only $25,000 to spend on this car, and you come back into the negotiation table and you're trying to push for 20,000, they're going to say, well, we know you have a budget for 25,000. So, I think for $25,000, this is a great price for a car. It's got all of these features, so on and so forth. And they're going to go back to that. Now, we did get a question of whether or not we should get a written summary of what has been agreed after each session to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that goes back into that negotiation process where it is super critical to make sure in that closure step you have an understanding of what has been communicated, because communications in negotiations, a lot of it happens verbally, but it should always follow up with a written dialogue so that everyone is on the same page and everyone is sharing the same information. All right, so with respect to traditional methods of communication, this is commonly known as positional bargaining. What I should have contextualized at the beginning is actually there are many, many, many different schools of thought when it comes to negotiations. We are part of a school of thought where we believe negotiations is about creating win-win scenarios. We believe in creating win-win scenarios. There is definitely negotiators out there who have a battle approach to negotiations, who have an approach that is very much focused around taking for as much as you can from the other party. But in my experience and in all the years that I've been doing business, it is a small world out there, and you are going to encounter people over and over again. And you don't want to be put into a position where you become the person that non grata that everyone's trying to avoid. So traditional methods of negotiation is really very commonly focused around positional bargaining. So, it's about, okay, well, let's split the difference. Let's go 50-50. You're at 10K, I'm at 9K. So let's split the difference and we'll go 9.5. And everyone leaves off a little bit unhappy and unsatisfied. The problem with that is, it is very one-dimensional. You're often faced with an either-or choice, sometimes favoring one party, and your choices are really limited due to negotiations being a battle of will. And there's really no desire to explore the full potential of what the negotiation is. And a lot of times you can actually find that opportunities lie dormant on both sides of the table. So we had a question earlier around, what do great negotiators think? What is their mindset? And I think there's a really great story around an orange. So two chefs are at a grocery store, and I don't know if you guys have heard this story before, but two chefs are at a grocery store, and there's one orange left. And the one chef says, I need this orange. I'm cooking tonight for a party of 50, and this orange is required. And the other chef says, well, I'm cooking tonight for the governor and his wife, and I need this orange. And, I have a Michelin star restaurant, and it's very important that I get this orange. So, both of them are leveraging, both of them are, presenting why they need this orange. And so they start fighting over this orange. Positional bargaining, you actually would recommend in typical positional bargaining is like, well, let's split the orange in half and give 50% to each, give half to one, half to the other. Well, I can't, I need the entire orange for my recipe. Well, I can't, I need the entire orange for my recipe. I can't work with just 50% of this orange. But what people are not asking, and what our approach to negotiations is centered around, is asking additional questions to understand the full picture. Because what you will actually find is one chef actually needs the rinds of the orange for his flambé dessert. The other chef needs the juice of the orange for his sauce that he's making for his duck l'orange. And so it's focused around creating additional opportunities, making sure that you work together with the other individual to understand both of your positions, understand what is the full actual picture here, and about growing the pie rather than splitting the pie. So that is where we get to, focusing on interest versus positions. So this is a great illustration, I think, when it comes to the way that a lot of people approach negotiations and the way that a lot of people view things, even I think in a day-to-day world. A lot of us see what is just on the surface of requirements, and that is really positions. My position is I don't want to go outside. My position is I'm at $10,000 for this specific item. My position is that I want to go on vacation in the summer. These are all positions. However, interests are actually what feed positions, and interests are ultimately going to be the source of conflict in your negotiations. They're much deeper and they're much more complex than positions, and they are much easier for you to find common ground once you understand interests. So we had a question earlier around, how do you approach a person that's staked out a position and is unwilling to move? I would start by actually understanding that person's interests, looking past that position. If they said, I absolutely cannot move on this position, right? I absolutely cannot go outside today. There's no way I'm going outside. I am not getting up from this table. Looking at it from the perspective of, okay, why is that the position? Why is that the position? What is feeding that? What is driving that? And interest can sometimes be very personal. It can sometimes be very business oriented. It can be very organizational. If somebody's in position is that I can only structure my agreement as a 3-year agreement because, corporate policy has deemed it that I cannot possibly stretch this policy. I cannot possibly structure this agreement to a 5-year agreement. Now, those are some of the things that actually could feed that position. And the question then should be, okay, well, why is it that corporate policy is deeming it to be 3 versus 5? Is it that, there's a concern around the financial stability of the organizations that are being contracted with? If that's the case, can I help you by demonstrating, providing more documentation around my financial health and providing more information around where we can provide that financial security so that you feel reassured as an organization, and now you found common ground on the interest level, which is going to help move your position. So one of the most important things with negotiations is to always have a strategy. And I can't emphasize that enough, because a lot of people go into negotiations and think, well, I'm charming, I'm charismatic, I'm extroverted, I'm whatever. And I'm a fast talker, I'm a smooth talker, all of these things. All of that doesn't count for anything if you don't have a strategy. Always have a strategy for how you're going to be negotiating. Now, it can be very, very difficult sometimes, because sometimes you're put into a negotiation on the fly. And it's okay to take a pause to say, listen, I'm going to need to take 5 minutes. I'm going to extract myself out of the situation. I'm going to think about my strategy, then I'll come back. And we say it all the time in negotiations. Just because you're in a negotiation room, just because you're on a call with somebody, does not mean you can't actually pause that negotiation. At any point in time, you can always take a break during a negotiation and extract yourself from the situation so that you have a clear mental capacity to think about how you're going to be approaching that negotiation, because that is going to be what is going to guide ultimately your negotiation strategy. Now, in addition to all of these things, we've put together 8 tips for negotiations that I found throughout my negotiation career, throughout teaching negotiations, throughout helping coach a lot of our team through their negotiations, are very, very helpful for driving a strong negotiation. The first thing, I think this is very Canadian. It is definitely universal, global, but it's definitely, I find Canadians themselves tend to be, this tends to be very hard for a lot of Canadians. Watching words, especially at the start. So avoiding weak words like prefer, like, targeting, and using strong words such as need, require, must have. And I would encourage you to go back home and try it with, the people that you're negotiating with. See how hard it is for you to actually not instinctively go to a very nicely worded, weak worded sentence structure. And I think part of this is because, we tend to be very happy. We tend to be very nice as Canadians. We tend to be very consensus focused. We want everyone to be happy, want everyone to agree. So when we negotiate, we say, oh, well, currently right now, we're hoping that you can do this, that, the other thing. And we would really appreciate if you could do this. And that sets up your negotiation message to have a much weaker message than if you were to say, listen, what we really need is for you to come back to the table and X, Y, Z. Number 2 is never give up something without getting something back. So understand the value of things and always trade rather than give concession. This is really around complex negotiations. If you're negotiating for more than one thing, more than 2 things, more than 3 things. Now, understanding, how important are all of these things in your mind? Is it really important that if you're negotiating for, your child to go outside, but also to finish his homework and also to do the dishes, which one's most important to you? And which one can you trade away in favor of the other thing? So if you're making a concession to say, okay, well, maybe it's not 30 minutes outside, but it's 15 minutes outside, do not just give that away, but link it to something else. Okay, you reduce your outside time by 15 minutes, but that also means that you need to get your homework done before 8 p.m. tonight. So linking and trading things together so that you never give up something without getting something back. And third thing is really get the other party's full list before negotiating. So avoiding cherry picking. Cherry picking is a skill and a technique that is taught in some of the other schools of negotiation, where it's really hold on to your list. Don't tell anybody your list until you've actually gotten them to concede on the first thing, and then you can tell them, oh, but one more thing. So it's okay, so can I have a cookie, but also a cup of juice? And also, can I have a lollipop? Also, can I have this? Also, can I have that? And when you've gotten the yes on the first item, you ask for the second item. So make sure that you get the other party's full list. Okay, is that all? Is that going to be all? Is that everything that you want? In which case, then you can start negotiating. Then you can decide where your position is going to be. And then we talked about aim highs, but it's so important to actually have an aim high that is legitimate. That position gives you room to move, but it's also a defendable target. You can come back to it and you can say, this is something within reason. I'm not asking something completely unreasonable, but it does give me room to move. And then on the 5th point, really focus on your agenda and control the dialogue. So focus on your targets and not the other party's targets. This is, again, that technique that's typically called anchoring. So what are your targets? Anchor back to your targets, because it can sound great that I'm providing you a 20% discount off of 100,000, but if your budget's only 50,000, that still doesn't do anything for you as far as that position goes. And then On the 6th point, make your first concession small, but give each concession a high psychological value. So making each concession seem like tying it with your leverage, tying it with your story, and giving it a high psychological value. Okay, I can throw in, some snow mats for the car because, we are in Calgary, and I understand that, during the winter, you get a lot of snow and a lot of slush, but you have to understand that that's not something that we do for everybody. That's not something that, everybody gets. It's definitely an ordinary. It's something that I'm going to have to get approval for, etc., etc. So making sure that your first concession is small, but giving it its high psychological value. And then understanding the other party's value items and linking them to your low cost items. So for that, it's about getting the full list. Once you have the other party's full list, what do they care about the most? So if we're talking dishes, computer time, and homework, what is the most important thing to the other party? Maybe it's computer time. If for you, maybe it's homework. So link the other party's value items to your low cost ones. So if you can say, okay, listen, I'll give you an extra 10 minutes on the computer, but that means you're going to have to finish your homework much earlier. You've made a small concession on your part for a large win on large gain for yourself, whereas the other party, they perceive that gain as a large value item. And of course, the 8th point, really, really, really have to emphasize this again. Be tough on the facts, but stay relationship focused. You will need to deal with these suppliers. You will need to deal with these negotiators in the future after the negotiation. People don't just disappear after you have a negotiation. Even in car dealerships, I've definitely, especially in a place like Calgary and places all over the world, you can deal with somebody in a negotiation and still run into them in the future. You never know who they are in the future. And so you want to make sure that you are tough on the facts, but you stay relationship focused. You preserve those relationships with those individuals. And you really, really, really do treat people like people. So the last thing I'll close on is really practice doesn't make perfect, but it definitely builds comfort. And what I found in years of negotiating for contracts, for corporations, for organizations, day to day in my own life, as I do it more, it definitely builds comfort. And the more that you do it, the more you can find yourself reacting and knowing how to react, knowing how to take a step back, when to take a step back, and when to make sure that you are taking the right approach to negotiations. Which tools are you the most familiar with using? Which styles are you the most familiar with negotiating? And what are the most effective types of tools and styles that you can find for the individual that you're negotiating with? So with that, I'll leave you guys with an activity and a suggested reading. So after this, I do recommend everyone to build a negotiation strategy for your mobile phone bill. It's one of the easiest practice grounds for anyone to start. And if they want to take a structured approach to a negotiation, think about your negotiation points, think about your leverage, think about your strategy, think about what your next steps are going to be, and then think about your timeline. Don't do it on a day where you're rushing to your next appointment in terms of availability. So that's part of building your strategy. Maybe you want to build your negotiation strategy so that it's in a time frame where you can say, okay, I've got the time to negotiate my mobile phone now for the next hour. Now I'm going to make this phone call. Obviously, I'm going to budget for some time being on hold, but these are also my leverage points. Also, I understand that mobile phone bills, I'm not going to be able to get to the people that really are going to be able to impact my phone bill until I ask to be transferred to customer retention and so on and so forth. So building all of that out and then really trying it out with your mobile phone bill. And, you can actually save yourself quite a bit of money with that too. And then the last thing I'll recommend for you guys is a book called Getting to Yes. It is by Roger Fisher and William Ern. And it is our textbook that we use for our negotiation course. It's something that definitely speaks to the school negotiations that we come from, that we found works very well in the corporate setting and in the personal setting. And it is something that we believe very strongly will be able to speak to how you should go about adopting negotiations in your day-to-day life. So with that, I will open it up for any other last questions, but I think we have addressed most of them.
I think you have covered the questions, yes. That's awesome. I guess other than the practice though, or what are some other comfortable ideas of practicing your negotiation? I know Canadians as a culture, we're not really good at that. And then I've traveled to other places, like I've gone to Mexico or Guatemala, and I have people telling me that, you know, you have to negotiate or people feel really insulted. And I'm still kind of very uncomfortable, even though I've done negotiation even as part of work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So again, it's one of those things where it's like practice makes perfect. And the more that you practice, the more comfortable you will become, the more it doesn't seem like such a taboo thing to say, I need this, or I absolutely have to have this. And it doesn't seem like a taboo thing to use the strong words and the leverage that you want to use. So that being said, I will say there is a difference between bartering and negotiations. And what happens in a lot of those markets is more bartering. And there, they don't care about relationships. They don't care about your leverage. They just care about, listen, you know, I've set this price here and I'm going to cut it here and so on and so forth. That being said, you can definitely take that as an opportunity to practice your negotiations. One of the things I hear the most common when I'm in some of those markets, like, oh, I live right around here. I come back all the time. I'll bring more friends here next time, so give me a discount, so on and so forth, right? So that's one that I definitely hear a lot. But the other space is really, you know, think about your personal life. Think about, and I think if you take a step back and you start to really think about the last week that you've had, what were some situations where, you know, you actually found yourself negotiating? And it's sometimes as simple as, you know, what are we getting for dinner? You know, I want sushi, you want Italian. Who's gonna, you know, have what they want to have for dinner that night? And maybe it's, again, you made the decision 2 times ago and the facts is, listen, sushi's more expensive than Italian and your leverage is so on and so forth, right? And so that's start thinking about your day-to-day and start recognizing yourself when you're in those negotiation situations and start practicing a lot of the toolkits, because then you'll get more familiar with it, you'll become more comfortable with it, and you'll be able to employ it much easier.
Excellent, thank you. I have another quick question here. In terms of wording, when you're talking about interest versus positions, what kind of wording can you do for anybody that doesn't do negotiations a lot to sort of get that conversation going, to find out what the true interests are, whether it's for a business or just for your personal life?
Well, I think the best way we all mastered this when we were like 2 years old. That's the why question. It's the why. But why is the sky blue? And why are the clouds there? And why? And it's I think that it's something called like 5 whys. If you go 5 whys deep, you're getting to kind of the deeper end of things in terms of like, what are some of the influences? So understanding if somebody is saying, you know, I'm taking this position, instead of trying to fight against it directly, try to understand, you know, what else is happening. Is there something else happening that's driving this? Is there a specific activity that's really pushing around this influence or this position that's forcing you into this position? Because sometimes, you know, people are just genuinely stuck in a rock and a hard place, in which case find out what makes that rock move, find out where that rock came from. And if you can remove the rock, then they can move.
Excellent, thank you, appreciate that. I think that we've been through all of the questions, and I think we're getting close to 1 o'clock here. So I just wanted to thank Jane for a wonderful, very thorough presentation. Learned a lot here. Hope everybody else did. And thank all the participants for joining. And see if Candida wanted to say a few words before we close off.
Hi, everyone. This was amazing. This was absolutely amazing. I can't believe how informative this was. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for closing our series. Everybody, thank you so much for participating, especially those of you that participated in all our series. And great job to the team for putting this together.